The soft breeze tangled in her hair, which fluttered behind her like black fire, now that her prey was so temptingly close, just a short distance from her sharp swords. Your storm processed more details of her enemy. The armor was not black, but had ebony trim and was adorned with bones, like the helmet, which looked like a severe skull, and in the sockets of those cold, lifeless eyes, your thunder used to look into the eyes of her victims as she killed them. She enjoyed witnessing the terror she saw there, and the stark reality that this was their last moment of existence. She reveled in the sensation of power it gave her, but the black and bone warrior betrayed none of it. His eyes only burned and disbelieving, as they were for her. Your thunder discovered in those last seconds before the combat that it was she who felt fear, not only fear, but a pure and rational terror, like a shadow taken from the shadow realm of Alendrock. Your thunder contemplated an apparition before her. The edges of his armor shone and smoked as if they were aflame and slowly bled into the mist, becoming part of it. She knew how to fight enemies of flesh and blood, but not against an incorporeal specter. Then, during the cascade of realizations and emotions that your thunder had never experienced before, something happened. She hesitated, the sharp flail's launch propelled by the momentum, 2 tongues of hellish steel, but failed to land a blow. Half staggering, already defeated by her own failed acrobatics, she gaped, incredulous, to see that the razor whips simply passed through him. Her eyes widened as the black and bony warrior seemed to disappear and reappear, as if wearing a field of archon flashes, and suddenly he was within reach, even though her eyes told her otherwise. Ythander refused to believe that she had been surpassed. The sensation did not last long. It was replaced by another pain that began as a warm sensation in her torso and turned into sharp needles in seconds, until she realized that she had fought her last duel and, although she hated herself for it, cursing herself inside as her precious soul was released into the warp, and towards her that was thirsty, she screamed as weakly as the wretches she had once treated with such joy. The Legion of the Damned remained a mythical legend that was rarely spoken of among the estates. Rarely mentioned because its true origin and intentions are unknown, and mentioning such apparitions could be considered heretical by some, as they only seem to appear as ghosts, as entities that appear to help other Astartes or Imperial servants in times of extreme need. They appear to help in desperate battles, and it has been documented that they have done so on numerous occasions. When it comes to the Legion of the Damned, there is suddenly no shortage of speculation about their origins, although in reality there's a lot of information about them. You just have to look for it, so I'm going to go over the available information, and for the simple fact of doing so, some of the most common speculations, although many have been relatively disproved. Although how much of that can really happen in 40k is another matter. You can decide for yourselves which one seems most plausible to you. I am always interested in your opinions on these speculative ideas, so do not hesitate to tell me which one you think it is and why in the comments of this video today, or if you have any other original idea about its origin. Also, the Legion of the Damned is one of those curious things of 40k. I put on the same level as the Bane Blade Scout tanks in a way, because there's a lot of material that helps to define them. As I said, you just have to look for it and read it. For example, Flame and Damnation. To begin with, the most established central theme of the Legion of the Damned is that they only appear in moments when a crushing defeat seems certain. They appear out of nowhere, often immediately initiating combat. One of their most terrifying traits is their seemingly singular and unstoppable focus on battle, advancing silently, without emotion, without apparent concern for any consequences, not even for themselves. They simply dominate with a weight and presence that few can match. Their enemies are torn apart as they rampage like a tsunami of revenge, and almost always seem to turn the tide of battle and turn it into a glorious victory. On occasions, their actions may even be considered an impediment to the Empire falling into an inevitable catastrophe. The Legion of the Damned does not have many lost warriors appearing at random. It does not seem that they usually appear at the request of others, but on occasions they may seem like prayers for some. However, whether it is a real call or just a coincidence is another matter. It is presumed that they choose their confrontations. Their appearances are scarce and spaced, which could suggest that they, or what controls their arrival, have a superior sense when selecting the importance of the events in which they intervene. But do not worry, we will go into all this later when we talk about their origins and what their purpose is, but they do seem to have some connection with the physical realm. For example, it has been observed that these Astartes, which are very little talked about, still wear power armor, although whether it is really armor or whether they are just a spiritual manifestation remains open to interpretation. Their ceramite is always a very intense black. It is even said that it absorbs the light around it, and it is adorned with iconography that recalls the most macabre aspects of the Imperium Calaveras. Many skulls, all of them magnificent skeletons with bones that envelop their weapons, and their bodies wrapped in flames of the immaterium or perhaps of the purgatory in which they exist. No one really knows the meaning of the ethereal fire that some eyewitnesses observe, who suggest that they were able to see the flesh of the Marines even in a state of decomposition. But the reliability of these accounts remains relatively unknown, despite the fact that their appearance still seems relatively corporeal. In reality, they are quite the opposite, but for those who pay more than casual attention, the energy weapons and energy swords of the Xenos may find no resistance in their armor, just as lightning and plasma discharges can pass through them without causing even a scratch. They have even been seen taking damage from heavy support weapons and simply ignoring it. Now, of course, sometimes the deadly weapons of the M41 hit the target, but as for the rules and parameters that govern when or why that happens, that is another matter. Even when an enemy weapon comes into contact and inflicts horrible damage, it does not seem to affect or slow down the legionaries in the slightest, who remain an unstoppable force moving forward, with their bolder shots igniting the air, other weapons, and energy spears and flames as they swoop down on their enemy. Anyone who has not fled the battlefield will soon be reduced to ashes when the legionaries open fire with the purifying flamethrowers, the heavy flamethrowers, and the multi-meltas, effectively incinerating anyone who dares to cower before the sudden attack. The others are simply stunned by the sudden change of luck and the appearance of these entities, but everything is irrelevant to the Legion of the Father, which never shows mercy, pause, or consideration for an enemy, whether armed, unarmed, defending himself, or fleeing. All are simply torn apart with masterfully placed massive reactive bolts, masterfully wielded bladed weapons, and the roar of chained words cleaving enemies from head to groin as the Legion vanishes into the ether. The only trace they leave behind is a bloody wake of shock or butchery and justified fury. Examination of the wreckage of the starship recovered in the Marin subsector suggests a link between the Legion of the Damned and the fate of the Firehawks chapter. The Firehawks were declared lost in the warp in 983 M41, 20 years after the entire chapter was sent to the world of Crow for a counterattack mission against the Xenos threat. But, as expected, the Inquisition is very interested in discovering whether, in fact, the Legion of the Damned and the Firehawks are actually the same chapter. If so, how is it that they have acquired their mysterious and deadly abilities? Why do they never communicate? Why has their appearance changed? However, subsequent conflicting accounts have suggested that the Firehawks were not completely destroyed and that some are still active, although apparently off the radar of established channels. This continues to increase the mysterious confusion around the Legion of the Damned, and an aspect of the Legion's participation, its implication with the Imperium, only became evident over time. That is, its appearance as saviors of the most loyal Imperial servants, often after Astartes. But at first, when they began to appear, it was not clear who or what they were, what their intentions were, or whose side they were on. They usually appear only when all hope is lost and can be considered a boon. Undoubtedly, many may see them as saviors, but beyond allowing a sanctioned objective to be fulfilled, it is not always evident why the Legion chooses a specific moment to appear. Sometimes, of course, the benefit seems immediately clear, such as saving a relic or protecting a bastion critical to humanity. Other times, however, centuries have passed before their reasoning becomes clearer, when a battle in which they appeared has repercussions far beyond any standard or reasonable prediction. This only increases the attention paid to their appearances, as their actions demonstrate at least some ability to exercise foresight when choosing their battles, that is, whether themselves or those they serve. There are additional, much more obvious reasons why the Inquisition is so interested in any report of the Legion's appearance. These events are meticulously documented. Everyone involved is interrogated, and members of the Inquisition, along with their administrative and psychic analysts, carefully examine the results and possible consequences. Of course, this has become even more desperate over time, as the Inquisition urgently wishes to establish the agenda of the Legion of the Damned, in addition to any further information. One of the most pressing questions would be who, if anyone, chooses their engagements and to what end, since, after all, the gods of chaos do not always act with clear immediate consequences. In fact, the forces of chaos can sometimes draw up masterfully complex plans that, at first glance, may seem beneficial even to the Empire, but ultimately collapse in a spectacularly devastating way, like a heretical house of cards. For the Inquisitors, however, establishing information and facts about the Legion is easier said than done, since the Legion often disappears as soon as it appears, and furthermore it does so without any pattern, making predicting its next appearance almost impossible. It is the norm of the Inquisition and the Empire that information about such unusual and unverified events be kept strictly restricted to those who need it, so they cannot simply send all the chapters to be vigilant. Although, of course, the myth of the Legion has been relatively consolidated among the study chapters. After all, nothing strictly heretical has occurred due to the participation of the Legion of the Damned, and, if anything, it has always been beneficial for some to bet that they act on behalf of the Emperor himself. Undoubtedly, this is the conclusion that any member of the ecclesiarchy could reach. Nevertheless, it remains the objective of the Inquisition to speak with the Silent Warriors and, if possible, to stop one of them. But if that were to happen, it would be very debatable how beneficial it would be, since they rarely speak, often only utter a few phrases, and only one case is known in which they interacted for a longer time. One of the strangest aspects of the Legion is its effect on eyewitnesses. In addition to any devices, such as service objectives, that may have been able to collect some evidence of a Legion manifestation, the mechanical spirits are often described as severely traumatized for some reason, and, to function again, they need to be brought back to life by a particularly attentive member of the Mechanicus before they can provide any record of the previous event, if they do. However, the strangest thing is that, for any mortal human witness, the vision of the Legion, which in other circumstances would seem such a significant event that it would never be forgotten, fades quite quickly from people's memory. If a member of the Inquisition or other investigator wishes to obtain some kind of first-hand account, they must visit the witnesses of the incident within solar days, preferably hours, before the incident becomes little more than a blurry and vague dream or a nightmare, whose presence in the mind is only maintained for longer thanks to the strength of the individual, which means that, fortunately, Astartes seem to be a slightly more reliable source of information. However, some persistent triggers will remain with the witnesses for weeks, years, or even the rest of their lives, leaving those who witnessed the Legion of the Damned with disturbed thoughts, restless sleep, and blurred memories that seem to be out of their reach, as if it were something that was forgotten a moment ago, but is now totally out of reach and can never be traced back to its origin. One of the fundamental reasons why the Inquisition, and, most likely, others such as the Navigators are eager to capture the Legion of the Damned, to study or learn from it, is their ability to always appear at critical moments and always in the most advantageous place to bring death to the enemy. To harness the abilities of the Legion, they are doomed to promise the power once held by the Eldar, only even greater. The Eldar, when their webway was at its peak, could travel throughout the galaxy at great speed and appear almost anywhere with vast armies. This is one of the factors that allowed them to defeat the Necrons. Of course, an immensely powerful race at that time. But now the webway network is broken, collapsed in some places, and closed in others, and the Eldar can no longer use it reliably. They know the key routes that are essential to them, but it is nothing compared to how it was used millions of years ago. Obviously, for the Imperium, traveling through the warp is absolutely terrifying, although unfortunately, it is now necessary. We could take literally that the Imperium travels through the warp, and it is far from it, something they would choose if there were another option. If there were literally any other means of traveling through the galaxy, humanity would probably choose it. In fact, it would be very interesting to see if the Tau, for example, were to discover some means of transport more efficient and faster than light. Such an event could change the rules of the game for the burgeoning Comic Sans race that uses Gundam pilots. Hey, I said it could be a good thing for the Tau. So for humanity, the prospect of finding some means of reliably and accurately negotiating the warp is something like the holy grail for the leaders of the Imperium. It's the kind of thing that, if it seemed reasonably achievable, no expense or effort would be spared to secure such a powerful advance. It would not be an exaggeration to say that it would very likely change the strength of humanity on a galactic scale. Some might suggest that it would, in fact, make the Imperium invincible, unstoppable. As things currently stand, forces must be divided throughout the galaxy. Entire planets must maintain huge, standing armies to prevent the potential threats posed by Xenos, heretics, and others. However, this is only necessary due to the enormous amount of time and logistics involved in moving Imperial forces from one place to another. Their wire studies chapters are spread throughout the galaxy, some based on fleets rather than simply being in the central sectors of the galaxy, because the Imperium distributes its forces very sparsely, but concentrates them in the most dangerous areas, those bordering Xenos territory, the Great Rift, etc. But if the ability to move forces almost instantaneously throughout the galaxy could be unlocked, it is almost impossible to comprehend how much the power of the Empire would be multiplied. Instead of a single study chapter, after fighting a great battle, you could bring 10, 20, 30, add some sisterhood, some Imperial Guard, why not several Titan Legions just in case? Obviously, it would be an incredibly powerful advantage, both tactically and in terms of the literal weight of military power that could be deployed, so it is not surprising that the Inquisition is so interested in the Legion of the Damned simply for their ability to appear. However, it is one thing for something to be interesting and quite another to achieve something practical with it. In addition, another mysterious reaction seems to occur around the Legion of the Damned. Whenever an Imperial servant, whether citizen, scholar, or inquisitor, is about to obtain real information about the Legion of the Damned through direct interaction, something conveniently gets in the way. That is, for example, fateful events that seem to keep them apart. Random seismic events, telekinetic births, sudden massive aneurysms, and even vehicle explosions. This separates the curious and the mysterious, and until the Legion disappears again, it is understandable that it does not wish to be interrogated, but curiously, it is as if they, or more likely something else, contain the power or the will to guarantee that such an event never takes place. But of course, there are exceptions that seem to suggest that perhaps they have a level of control. But I must admit that this specific rarity is one of those things of the Legion of the Damned that makes me want to ramble at length about the time and the conflicts in which, perhaps, a physical reality tries to interact with another invisible, mysterious force that wants to prevent it, which reminds me a lot of something I've talked about before, that series about time travel called 11/22/63. In the series, any attempt to change the past causes not the individuals, but the events, essentially reality itself, to react with increasingly dramatic and aggressive situations. It is an interesting concept, and, very briefly, the idea is something similar to what I've pointed out before. While it is not known for sure how the future is determined, the past is something that, despite what the movies will make us believe, is determined has happened, so you cannot go back and change it, since it has taken place, and things keep moving forward in 11/22/63. This plays with the idea that the past is really structured by laws that can be visited and to which one can go, but just like in 11/22/63, going back and changing it, it has already taken place and things keep moving forward. In 11,2263, it plays with the idea that the past is structured by laws. It can be visited and go there, but just as we have laws for physics, the past can accommodate and tolerate a certain presence in it. But if you try to change it too much, the very fabric of reality will resist because you cannot change what is solid and established. And the consequences for anyone who tries to distort the established order are apparently lethal. Now, there are other narratives that play with this idea that time and reality overlap when they shouldn't, and that causes unforeseen consequences, such as someone going into a coma in the movie Primer. In fact, I think it is very reasonable that something as mysterious and ethereal as the Legion of the Damned is very difficult to interact with. I mean, they can literally be shot with heavy weapons, and they deflect them. One can imagine an Inquisitor trying to capture a Legion of the Fallen, and upon touching their armor, being consumed by an ethereal flame that leaves nothing more than a small pile of ashes where they were, or falling into a massive attack and a permanent coma, or perhaps any attempt to interact with them causes some nearby physical disaster that blocks the way to them. You get the idea, but as I say, there are exceptions, notable exceptions that we will get to shortly, but this lack of certainty around the Legion of the Damned maintains that air of mystery, fear, and its dominant or inspiring presence that stuns the loyal Imperial servants and massacres the enemies of humanity. In terms of what we can say with relative certainty about the Legion of the Damned, a fairly short list of common themes emerges. However, if you delve into the lore itself, some of the details that are taken for granted are not generally correct. This depends, as always, to some extent on how you want to interpret the first and second-hand Imperial reports of others returning to the Imperium. First of all, is their ability. This is basically true. According to all testimonies, the Legion of the Damned has a master level in their abilities, which is fine. However, there is one thing, and this tends to be a broader problem, since when talking about someone's or a faction's skill, how exactly is it measured? Especially if it is pointed out by other already very expert studies, since our studies are intended to be the pinnacle of human warriors. So, when they describe other Marines as masters, where is the point of reference? If they can kill other studies with ease, are they Primarch-level custodians, Grey Knights? Is it fair to say that the legionaries are cursed, or just very good with weapons? Perhaps a better example is when the forces of the Traitor World Eaters were assaulting a graveyard world and a Legion of the Damned approached a blood-soaked son of Ongron with great speed and in total silence. So much so that only when the traitor finally turned around, in a fraction of a second, was he able to realize that something was falling on him, but it was already too late. A sword wielded by a legionary was already in his throat, and, with a deliberate and precise movement, the legionary cleanly cut the armor from his neck, piercing the flesh to the bone. The World Eater fell dead to the ground, with a crimson ocean gushing from his neck. The Legion of the Damned had already left, without comments, without pauses, without hesitations, passing to the next traitor in a permanent silence. This is only partially true, since most of the time the Legion are described as absolutely silent, ethereal warriors. They stand out for fighting in silence, although silence only means that they do not run across the battlefield shouting for the Emperor or counting the seven and all that. However, the idea that the Legion of the Damned is completely silent at all times is not entirely correct. Although the normal Space Marines of the Legion seem to speak very little, they're known to speak to normal mortals, although it is usually very briefly and often when they are about to die, saying something like "for the Emperor" or "only in death." The most significant exception is, of course, the Brother Sergeant Centurion, who seems to be the designated spokesman for the Legion of the Damned and is the only one who has held prolonged conversations. We will talk more about it shortly, but basically, does the Legion of the Damned exist in a permanent state of silence, always appearing when the Imperium needs it? No, this is true, as has already been commented. The Legion of the Damned has the habit of appearing not only in moments of urgency, but in crucial moments, which suggests that they can foresee what actions will have a significant or long-term impact for the Imperium. Is this psychic foresight? Do they reside in a realm that allows them to see critical moments? Or does whoever commands them have the power of foresight? We do not know, but we can state with certainty that they always appear in these critical moments. What is less certain is how they appear. Sometimes it is said that they materialize in reality as ethereal ghosts that appear out of nowhere. Other times it has been reported that they specifically teleport. Now, that could be attributed to an individual under pressure confusing one thing with another, but I must point out that the Legion of the Damned is not known for its ability to teleport. Sometimes it is said that they materialize in reality as ethereal ghosts that appear out of nowhere. Other times it has been reported that they teleport visually. Now, that could be attributed to a person under pressure confusing one thing with another, but I must point out that in the only codex that exists about the Legion, they are condemned. A cited reference points out that the air around the bridge heated up, and a moment later, a squad of heavily armed space marines materialized by teleportation, which was theoretically impossible, since the Inquisitor Americus had already confirmed the presence of a translocation interference field. Their studies were covered with black power armor adorned with images of skulls, rib cages, hands, and other various bones. As soon as they appeared, they opened fire on the Elder with an impressive variety of flamethrower weapons. I observed that the characteristic smell of petrochemical products or any fuel was totally absent. Nevertheless, the flames were effective and many of the Xeno's command staff were reduced to ashes. After this encounter, the Legion adapted and disappeared from sight, so it is still unknown exactly how they are. It could also be that they use something beyond standard teleportation, perhaps even a Xeno's device, some technology that allowed them to translocate, but that simply looked like teleportation. Alternatively, given everything that is known about their nature, it could simply be another curiosity of the warp, but like so many other details about the Legion, it is really until we know otherwise. Another myth that can be debunked is the idea that the Legion of the Damned appears to fight and then disappears immediately. Although this is true in most cases, there are known exceptions in which they had no weight after the battle, but even a representative faced mortals to save something. What is generally observed in the Legion of the Damned is that they do not seem to habitually use physical hardware, such as tanks, speeders, or transport ships. They almost always seem to appear only as infantry. They have been seen using some kind of spaceship that appeared to be of Imperial origin, but that also looked a lot like a ghost ship, since they themselves were enveloped in an ethereal flame that danced on them, which helps reinforce the idea that they are the remains of a Legion or destroyed chapter, and could also help explain why they do not have heavy support material to take to the battlefield. Alternatively, perhaps in their current state, they are simply unable to use such equipment, although they seem to use firearms and energy weapons, including plasma. However, as has been observed, like all aspects of the Legion of the Damned, these appear to be only visually representative and not based on any physical material, since they do not use fuel or energy to fire those weapons, which points again to the fact that they are of a psychic nature. And from the immaterial realm, the warp. Finally, it would be true to say that they almost always appear anonymous. No name is given or pronounced for any of the members of the Legion of the Damned, except, of course, that individual whose name was only discovered and associated by chance. Brother Sergeant Atticus Centurion, who is believed to be a veteran sergeant of the Honorable First Company of the Legion of the Damned, or possibly of what preceded them. He is mainly identified by carrying the Animus Malorum, an ancient relic in the form of a skull that can drain the souls of mortal targets and use that power to resurrect and empower his companions of the Legion of the Damned who have fallen in battle, thus reinforcing their ranks. He has also been seen tearing the soul from loyal Astartes, allowing them to become members of the Legion of the Damned. Strangely anonymous, as we have said, an individual appeared among them, this Brother Sergeant Atticus Centurion. It is not clear why he seems to speak on behalf of the Legion, but on several occasions he has confronted mortal humans and has also shed light on the Legion itself in the story Legion of the Damned, where a neophyte discovers the coffin of Anastari in the cemetery craters of the world Syrtis Minor, the one that opens as a plaque that describes Brother Sergeant Attica Centurion, honored in the First Company, dedicated in Paratum Ultra Articulum Mortis by the Emperor beyond the point of death. This further complicates the theories about the origin of the Legion of the Damned, not to mention when Atticus appears in the story Animus Malorum. Attention, spoilers for the rest of this segment. So, after the Legion of the Damned saves a group of Marines and humans on a planet, as usually happens, they confront these spectral warriors, but they do not leave immediately. In fact, this is where they seem to have the relic known as Animus Malorum, which Centurion carries with him apparently everywhere. Next, the Legion explains that this object is one of their most sacred relics, and that the attack of the Xenos could have caused its destruction, hence their appearance. Centurion explains that the value and honor of the estates were never questioned, but he also explains that there is a growing debt that must be paid with souls. This helps us understand a common misconception regarding the Legion. It is often presumed that they act as martyrs for some sense of shame or to cleanse their honor, just as during the heresy and in its aftermath, some lost estates who remained loyal to the traitor legions felt compelled to embark on these crusades of penance, effectively becoming black shields, or how some planets, such as Krieg and Vostroya, carry with them what now appear to be permanent debts to the Imperium. There are many other similar examples of planets, chapters, and peoples who rebelled against the Imperium and failed in their duty, and then embarked on a crusade in search of redemption. This is why people assume that this is what happens with the Legion of the Damned. It makes sense. A lost chapter fails and must repent for its chaotic performance in the eyes of the Emperor. It is a story as old as time, except that perhaps it is an oversimplification. There may be some truth in it, but, as Centurion makes clear, the Legion of the Damned does not seem to act out of a purely penitent motivation, nor does it seem to seek martyrdom. I mean, they're already dead, and, moreover, to be a martyr, it has to be explicitly clear why you died, for what reason, what was your agenda, what was your ideology, and it often helps to have a name if you want to be a martyr, so they do not really fit that mold. It does not make much sense, so when Centurion speaks of miracles that have a price and a growing count, it is worrying, even especially for the estates to whom he directs that conversation. The debt incurred, however, seems to fall on the Imperium more than on the individuals saved by the Legion. And to pay the debt, it must be paid to the Legion in souls. Essentially, the Legion of the Damned acts for its service to help and save the Imperium in these critical moments, but although they are spectral, they're not immune to the weapons of the material realm. It is true that sometimes weapons pass directly through them, but this seems, for some reason, not to be a permanent state of immunity, since they seem to enter and leave reality and, sometimes, undoubtedly suffer damage and can fall in combat because of it. Unlike ordinary studies, although the Legion is unable to replenish its troops by ordinary means, they grow and develop new legions of the fallen. So this Animus Malorum is what Centuries uses to take the souls of the Imperials or the studies and reinforce the ethereal forces of the Legion of the Fallen, although apparently there are exceptions, and this is where we see the brother captain of the Astartes in this story told by Centuries, who is going to be recruited by the Legion, something that no one imagined until then was possible. This also suddenly opens up some theories about the Legion, its origins, and what they are. Centurion tells the captain, "We would love you, Captain Eresis. We would claim you as a worthy member of the Legion. You are ready to give your life in defense of this world, and even in death to deny it to the enemy from the bones of your noble lineage, with the foundations of the empire built where you lead and others follow without question. As a martyr, you would be wasted, but as a legionary you will be eternal." This does not seem to be the case for the rest of the Astartes who survived that incident. Apparently, they have been condemned by the Centurion, and this is remarkable because it definitely supports the idea, as some suggest, that the Legion has a cursed side, and they are not entirely the saviors that are often presented as the Tech Marine. There he realizes his imminent disappearance and tries to argue with the Centurion. Ares did not speak on behalf of all of us in this, and Centuria seems to consider it for a moment before drawing his chainsword. Your captain would have given his life selflessly and unconditionally in the service of the Emperor, but your sacrifice was in vain. It was expected. It was ordered. That is why your soul is lost. The debt is too great, and the account increases with each passing decade. It increases. A cold numbness took hold of the tech marine's fingers. His pistol fell from his hands. He could hear nothing but the agonies of his brother agony through the Vox link before everything fell into a terrifying silence. Not for you, the immortal servitude of the Legion. You will pay what you owe. Music. The Inquisition has continually tried to record all known cases in which the Legion of the Damned has appeared, since if they ever want to achieve their goal of working with them or obtaining useful technical information about them, the first step would be to catalog their appearances and try to understand what could be deduced from such encounters. Unfortunately, it tends to provide few answers or data that can help formulate a plan of action. If anything, it only serves to underline the seemingly random nature of their appearances, which is not helped by the fact that they seem to occur throughout the galaxy, so establishing a permanent research team in one area would not be beneficial either. Many incidents related to the Legion of the Damned have been recorded to maintain a record. We have selected some that could be of greater interest and that illustrate the profound implications of the Legion's actions after the assault by the forces of chaos on an adamantium mining operation and the defeat of the forces of the Militarum. It is said that strange marines began to appear, repelling the wave of demons in what would become known as the Pyroclastic Cataclysm. After these mysterious Astartes were repelled by a huge demonic force, those who became authentic Hellblades proved that the fire of the legionaries was capable of burning even the flesh of the demons, and the Slaneshi entities were sent back to their unclean kingdom amid screams. During the fighting, a dozen new veins of adamantium were uncovered by weapon explosions that scarred the surface of Villadad Prime. The nearby forge world of Lipitu Anvil tripled its production of war material, guaranteeing that most of its workers benefited the chapters of the Adeptus Astartes. When the High Fleet Moloch invaded the Imperial weapon testing planet of Godba, the Tyranids discovered that the world had its own ruthless bite, from unclassified super-heavy war machines to macro Gatling cannons employed by the series of Tech Priest engines that oversaw the defense of the planet, with all the phalanxes of Beyblades and Shadow Swords leading the charge against the invaders. Unfortunately, it was not enough, and when the situation seemed desperate, and a last group of the last remaining Shadow Swords emerged stunned to see squad after squad of Space Marines forming a cordon around their tanks, the volleys of their bolters and the undulating flames of their heavy weapons repelling the gaunts of the Tyranids. The arrival of more super-heavy tanks and almost 100 more legionaries tipped the balance in favor of the Imperium. The invading swarm was shattered, dispersed, and finally exterminated within the system. One of the most important appearances of the Legion of the Damned involved the chief librarian Tigurius, who had led an ultramarine shock force to rescue a delegation of tech priests from the orc invasion of the world of Andraxis. On the world and inside its great bastion, the Mechanicus had unearthed the psychic staff with the recognition codes of the Sigillite. The recovery of the artifact was paramount. Unfortunately, the planet was already invaded, so the orcs descended on the bastion in impossible numbers. Everything seemed lost, as what appeared to be their last day in the service of the Emperor was dawning. The Legion of the Damned burst into real space. The slaughter was immense, and the orcs scattered. The bastion was secured, and the staff was recovered. After a more detailed study, it revealed important details about the construction of the Golden Throne and allowed a better understanding of the sacrifice made in the name of the Imperium. It is believed to still be in the possession of the chief librarian. It should be noted that Tagirus seems to have reported this event with the Legion of the Damned as having occurred in 967 M41, although it is also recorded as having occurred in 922 M41. As I always like to remember, within the Imperium things are often filed very incorrectly, and it remains unclear, unless there is some other inexplicable problem, whether the report was given at the behest of a minor order of the Inquisition known as the Obsoletus. In fact, this is the only known mention of them, and an inquisitor named Darius. It is not known if they were destroyed, merged with another ordo, or what became of them. Nothing more has been said or known about them, but the chief librarian's report to the inquisitor was as follows. An hour before dawn, I called the company to prayer, and, since our chaplain had been killed, we made peace with the emperor in the style of battle. It was when I raised my eyes from prayer that I saw a strange host where moments before there was nothing but darkness. At first I thought it was some connivance of the orcs, but as the host advanced, I realized that they were space marines, so they did not belong to any chapter under the command of the Emperor. Their armor was black and had chilling images of bones and fire. They wore skulls on their helmets. As they advanced, an unsettling glow enveloped them, and fire seemed to dance around their feet like the bones of men in the torment of purgatory. They looked more like skeletons than living men, but they made no noise. For a while I thought it was some ghost, a vision of ancient times, but I had heard the Emperor grant such visions to his warriors who faced death in his name. But it was not so, because soon the ghostly warriors reached the battle line of the orcs, and, suddenly, the air was filled with the roar of battle, and the orcs screamed and cried in terror. Those of us who remained watched the Dark Battle Brothers at their work, and I had never before seen a fight like the one I witnessed that dawn. Seizing the moment, I regrouped my company and led them to war, but little work remained to be done. The orcs lacked the courage to fight. We soon secured the Great Bastion once more, and, without further losses to the Dark Brotherhood, there was no sign of them. And then, in what I must say is one more note to add to the shameful litany of cases in which the 5th Imperial Fist Legion is about to be destroyed, comes the story of the Phalanx, the monastic supership used by the chapter as a space monastery, while orbiting around Terra, his old friend. The Iron Warriors swarmed out of the warp and burst into battle as the newly forged Imperial Fist struggled to repel all invaders. But, unfortunately, they failed to stop the attack of the demon Prince Belliker. The Iron Warriors then attempted to use the immense power of the orbital weapon systems aboard the ship to attack the Imperial Palace on Terra, which would have been terrible, but, not having studied enough to stop them, the Imperial Fist performed an emergency translation to the warp. The situation seemed desperate, but when the Imperial Fists proved that they were unable to defend their own monastery fortress, finally a spectral fire swept through the lower decks, burning the demonic horrors, and from the fire came an entire army of the Legion of the Damned, who set to work showing the Imperial Fists how it should be done, exterminating all the demons they found. The Imperial Fists were finally forced to launch their own counterattack against the forces of the Iron Warriors and eventually cleared the ship of traitors. Now, as noted above, this is one of the cases in which the Legion would remain after the battle. They would stay aboard the Phalanx to support the Imperial Fists as the massive ship traveled to aid the defenders of Cadia from the emerging 13th Black Crusade. The Legion would then appear in the Blackstone Fortress as well to aid in the space battles, destroying an energy exchanger and allowing the Phalanx to disable the Blackstone Fortress. Unfortunately, we all know the end of that story, and the Blackstone Fortress was thrown into Cadia, where the planet was devastated. This is one of the cases in which the Legion of the Damned, despite their efforts, could not prevent a catastrophe for the Imperium. Speculation about the true nature of the Legion runs rampant among the connoisseurs of the Imperium. Ideas range from scholars suggesting that the Legion of the Damned are a kind of psychic reaction made reality by broken individuals, simply twisted by the events of the warp, such as the Ista massacres or the death of a pre-march, which were so traumatic that they are believed to have left a permanent psychic scar on the psyche of all the legions. Some wonder if events like these actually had a much greater impact than anyone could have imagined, and if it was these events, the trauma of heresy itself, that led to the creation of the Legion of the Damned. Among the Summer Studies chapters, we have come to believe a version of this story, according to which the pain and rage felt by many Marines throughout the subsequent foundings has given rise to a kind of collective agony that then manifests unconsciously in the warp. Others suggest that it is not only the estates, but a broader power of hope that unites throughout humanity to empower and form the Legion of the Damned, similarly perhaps to the Eldar in their most ancient times, when collective thought was powerful enough to build and create entities from the warp itself. This would make the Legion of the Damned a kind of demon. These studies have come to represent the hope and just the fury of the Emperor. Thus, within that idea is the theory that the billions of humans populating the Imperium contribute to a kind of psychic reserve that can be accessed. This is used, for example, by the sororities and also other entities that manifest. The most common theory about the Legion of the Damned is that, in reality, they are the remains of the old chapter of the Firehawks of Estates and the successor of the Ultramarines, who disappeared never to be seen again after being sent to face some Xenos. But, of course, there is more to that, which we will enter into in the temperament. The Firehawks were famous for their bellicosity. Their battle tactics focused almost exclusively on the application of overwhelming force to cause the total and immediate destruction of the enemy. But they were not mindless berserkers, nor world eaters, and they never wasted their own lives in the pursuit of impossible goals. In fact, this caused them some problems. They often walked away from battles where they were greatly needed if they considered the overall outcome too costly. This apathy also left them with a somewhat tarnished reputation for being too direct and cold with others. Some loyal members of the Empire disapproved of their methodology, so much that they were, in fact, on the verge of branding them as traitors, especially for their attitude of refusing to sacrifice themselves for anything other than the noblest cause. And when they engaged in battle, the result was the total destruction of anyone who stood in their way, regardless of whether it was a good idea or not. Furthermore, unlike most Space Marine chapters, the Firehawks were very strict followers of the Imperial cult, believing in the divinity and humanity of the Emperor and the manifest destiny of the Emperor to dominate the galaxy. For example, in the early 36th millennium, their faith was so deep that they became deeply involved in the wars of the Age of Apostasy, while many other chapters prefer to stay out of this cruel religious civil war, paying with blood their convictions in support of the Thorian reformers of the Confederation of Light against the unreformed ecclesiarchy. The Firehawks were also firm believers in the Empire of Man established by the Emperor. They showed a singular interest in the destruction of renegade Imperial commanders, apostate cardinals, and other rebellious Imperial lords, and frequently razed entire cities and colonial worlds to achieve their goals. The chapter has often been more appreciated among the High Lords of Terra and their agents than many of their other wartime allies, especially among the Astartes. For this reason, several other Space Marine chapters are known to consider the Firehawks darkly corrupted and believe that they are still corrupted in some way. Because of these flaws, some speculate that if they are the Legion of the Damned, their goal is to remedy these flawed methods with their penance. One thing I will say is that some people seem to have a very firm opinion on the Firehawks theory, but I just want to remind us that, like everything in 40k, these details are not an unequivocal position, although this one is quite solid compared to other ideas I have seen, which, although possibly more interesting, do not seem to have the same weight of evidence. It is true that some of the other central speculations about the Legion of the Damned point to their origin being based on the warp, but it is also true that they still seem very tied to reality. Furthermore, in the story entitled Legion of the Fallen, a neophyte discovers the coffins of Astati on the cemetery world of Syrtis Minor, among them that of a member of the Legion of the Damned. The mentioned centurion opened the lid, which bounced on its thick hinges, revealing a dark, empty interior. Looking inside, Omar found nothing. Nothing remained of the Adeptus Astartes he expected to find. Inside the lid, the explorer discovered a simple plaque identifying a genetic code in symbols and numbers, a name, a rank, and the company motto, Brother Sergeant Atticus Centurion, honored in the First Company, in dedicato imperatum ultra articulum mortis, for the Emperor beyond the point of death. The interesting thing about that inscription is that it is the same motto that appears on the banner of the Firehawks chapter, as seen on their ruined banner recovered in 988 M41. Now, it seems like a pretty clear situation, but it is not necessarily conclusive proof, since we know the scenario surrounding Centurion, and we know that the Legion is capable of incorporating good-natured novices into its ranks through the Animus Malorum. There is nothing indicating that the Centurion sergeants were not simply individuals subjected to the same practice. There are those who believe that the Firehawks suffered some kind of strange metamorphosis after their disappearance. They were irreversibly changed by the tides of the warp, dying and, in some way, remaining alive, knowing that they could never openly serve the Empire in their warp-tainted state. They became the Legion of the Damned, fighting for the Emperor in the hell that their home had become, using the souls of others to compensate for their losses and considering it a necessary sacrifice in the name of the Emperor. It is always tempting, in a universe as complex and varied as that of 40k, to give far-fetched and complex explanations about the events and characters that make up the history of the Imperium. However, it must be pointed out that, as fun as it is sometimes, the truth is that the simplest theory is usually the most accurate, and, in this case, given the nature of the Legion, this very direct explanation seems the most credible. That the Firehawks were lost in the warp, and the damage they suffered somehow altered them, and now they remain as spiritual echoes of what were once great space marines, whose religious passion and burning hatred for the enemies of the Empire were so powerful, that they transcended mortal limits and expressed themselves in their own physical being, now in an eternal state. It could also mean that the Firehawks were simply the beginning of what became the Legion of the Damned, and it is possible that others like them have died and resurrected as members of the Legion of the Damned, or that they have found their way to them in the ethereal plane. The few reports of those who have seen the Legion of the Damned without a helmet speak of a ghostly power, sunken skin, empty eye sockets, and skulls. As expected, all the supernatural events and all the anomalies in reality that are attributed to the mysterious warriors also give credibility to the theories about them. Perhaps those who know of their existence prefer to imagine these spectral space marines as revenants. For what mortal mind could endure a life tied to the infernal dimension of the warp and remain sane? We also learned more thanks to a data logger that was sent back to Terror after the Legion of the Condemned saved a research station from an orc attack, which secretly revealed to the Administratum the truth of what had happened to the Firehawks after embarking on their fateful journey to the warp. The entire fleet had been trapped in a warp storm of terrible intensity. Stunned by the power of the warp, the chapter was forced to endure attacks by powerful warp entities. Ship after ship was destroyed and absorbed into the fabric of the Imperium. Finally, only one ship remained, with nothing to lose at that point, in a situation similar to that of the crew of the Eisenstein. The ship shot out of warp space and found itself in the far east of the galaxy, thousands of light years beyond the psychic light of the Astronomicon. Only 200 Firehawks remained, seriously injured. All the chapter's gene seed had been lost in the warp, and all other elements, including officers, initiates, and servants, had also perished. In the following months, their unprotected exposure to the warp caused their skin to decompose and blacken. They all suffered excruciating pain and began to die slowly. Whatever they had been exposed to was so severe that, when they found their way back to Imperial space, half of the Marines who had survived had already died. But then we get to this part that really makes a bit of sense. It is said that those who remained were so sore and shattered by this terrible experience and by their suffering that they lost all their sanity and became the Legion of the Damned. Yes, that's right, despite being crazy and having barely survived, they all decided that they were going to become a Legion of the Damned, and they changed their armor, painted it, put skulls everywhere, and that's it, problem solved. If this sounds clumsy, meaningless, and forced, it is because this last section that explains the disappearance of the Firehawks is quite old and ends up looking like a piece of a puzzle that really seems like it should fit. But it is not the right piece, but there does not seem to be another, so you force it into place. This problem, this evident strangeness, could be solved very easily with a small update in some place in history, a small adjacent history, a fragment of information found in a ship, a relic, or an encounter. Anything like that could help clarify this with respect to the Firehawks. So yes, if you want to lean on the theory of the Firehawks, it's okay, but you have to accept that the end of the story is basically that they decided to become the Legion of the Damned, which seems horrible to me despite all the problems they had, half of them dead, in a terrible situation, simply destroyed, and then they make this great decision and return to the warp, and everything is fine. There is no explanation, and that is the great unknown. That is why I personally find the theory of the Firehawks quite unacceptable, because despite all the evident and apparently documented tests, the piece that breaks it is the last one, the most credible and the most critical. It simply does not make sense, and I cannot accept it. The following theory is a common speculation, but I think it is also an analysis that is too elaborate. It is based on the fact that, in Master of Mankind, The Emperor summons an alleged proto-legion of the damned formed by the betrayed dead of Istvan shortly after the situation had occurred, as well as a headless giant that is sometimes speculated to be Ferrus Manus, the Primarch. The quote says, "The Emperor raised the sword with both hands, tightened his knuckles, and the geography of the circuits lit up along the blade, spitting electric fire, and, seeing the sword wrapped in flames, he said nothing, nor did he look at any of his warriors. The sword descended through the network. It caught fire. Shapes raged in the flames. Shadows and suggestions fought against the demons, their burning forms indistinct and changing. The avatars born of fire have fallen. 10,000 submerged up to their knees in psychic fire, and pushing with spears of fire. The silhouettes of the space marines, the betrayed dead of Istvan, carrying axes, swords, and claws. The symbols of the massacred legions are glimpsed, obscured by the ashes of their blackened armor. A giant among giants, with his large bare hands and ready as he advanced scorching on the crest of the fire of the tide, the 10th son of a dying empire, briefly reborn in the immolating anger of his father. Now many people have speculated that these dead of Istvan become the Legion of the Damned. An obvious answer would be that the Emperor used his power to call their souls to his aid before they were lost in the warp forever. The final act for them only ends duty in death. In fact, a member of the Legion of the Damned even says that phrase aloud. Millennia after this moment, perhaps the Emperor used more power than he intended when invoking them, so that unknowingly they were imbued with an excess of the Emperor's psychic power, which allowed them to remain and now exist trapped in something similar to a purgatory between the material realm and the immaterium, the warp. If that were true, it would help explain how they are able to easily enter reality and appear anywhere when it is necessary. It would also help explain how they are able to appear throughout many millennia as something similar to ethereal specters. I think this could also easily fit with the symbiosis of the tarot, the idea that they are able to somehow connect with the immense psychic prescience of the master of humanity, and through him, see moments of the future in the swirling tides of the warp. Now, something that people may not like to know is that, in relation to this idea about Ferrus Manus and Dembski Bowden, the author of Master of Mankind has publicly stated that he believes that at that time, it was the spirit of Ferrus Manus who appeared, although I have to say that it really sounds like it was a dying 10th son giant, an empire reborn in the immolating anger of his father. I mean, who else could it be? Another small thing to keep in mind, which is really superficial, but they're called the Legion of the Damned, and the Legion stopped existing after the heresy. So if they did not originate in the period of the heresy, why would they be called the Legion and refer to themselves as legionaries? In fact, why would the Firehawks suddenly start referring to themselves as legionaries and to the Legion? So I think that for all those reasons, this adds a little more weight to the balance of this argument. But it also helps to illustrate the reasons why there was so much speculation about the Legion, since often its origin and the clues that point in all directions contradict each other. The Inquisitor Kiosk, before being murdered by Gregor Eisenhorn, speculated that it was the omnipresent faith of humanity in the Emperor that formed this Dark Legion. In this sense, he postulated that they were not very different from the demonic servants of the gods of ca. Omnipresent faith of humanity in the Emperor, what had formed this Dark Legion. In this sense, he postulated that they were not very different from the demonic servants of the gods of chaos, and that, just as they were fragments of their masters, so was the Legion of the Emperor. The Inquisitor also speculated that perhaps this could lead to the appearance of even greater and unknown forms, similar to the great demons of chaos, but of the Emperor. Their observable behavior somewhat supports this idea. The Legion seems capable of appearing anywhere and at any time without using the network or warp portals. They can literally appear out of nowhere, which brings into play the idea of purgatory between the warp and reality. But it could also be that they are beings of the warp, since only the demons of chaos can apparently appear anywhere and at any time. However, a key point is that demons can normally only appear if a god of chaos actually exerts enough power, or if they're summoned in another way, or using some other portal between the realms, or as if they were consumed and deformed psychic, etc. The Inquisitor pointed out that according to his records, the Legion tended to appear in areas where the barrier between the realms was weak or non-existent, or using some other portal between the realms, or as if they were a consumed psychic and are summoned in another way, or through the use of some other portal between the realms, or as a consumed, deformed psychopath, etc. While the Inquisitor pointed out that, according to his records, the Legion tended to appear in areas where the barrier between the warp and real space was said to be thin. It has always been said that the Legion of the Damned appeared anywhere the Empire needed it, but there is no real indication that that statement is more than speculative mythology, an illusion of the faithful, because if you believe strongly enough in your hour of need, the Legion of the Damned will appear and save you, except that it is not true, and, if it were, there would certainly be more parameters for their appearances than those that are appreciated with the naked eye. As for their appearance, they're always enveloped in ethereal fire. What do we think of when we think of things wrapped in ethereal flames? Well, one of the things that comes to mind the most is the Emperor's sword. Another observable clue is that they always fight in silence. Of course, they're not the only ones who do it, and it should be noted that the chapters of the Summer Studies or the Legion were known for fighting in silence as a psychological weapon, but still it could point to the fact that they are rather projections of a superior power. The speculative idea here is that the Legion of the Damned are not ghosts or lost souls, as is sometimes believed, but are, in fact, projections, extensions of the psychic will of the Emperor within the Inquisition. Some believe that the Emperor is still trapped on the throne, others believe that he exists in a state between life and death, and others believe that he has already transcended to the afterlife a long time ago, and that all that remains now in the Terror is his physical form. The Golden Throne acts more as a gateway to channel power to the Emperor in the warp, reinforced, of course, by his worship throughout the galaxy, feeding him as if he were a god of chaos. Of course, this has no basis, but it is a plausible concept that has been around for some time. I mean, I think it makes sense if we think about how many humans in the galaxy worship the Emperor as a god, and with what we know about the warp, it is reasonable to assume that this could be very powerful. So in all this speculation, it has some basis. It is not at all implausible, but it seems somewhat discredited by the fact that Centurion reappears as someone who existed outside the warp. Not to mention these descriptions of how he recruits new souls for the warriors of the Legion of the Damned. Even so, that may not in itself be proof of anything. Just because a box somewhere bears his name does not rule out other scenarios. It may simply mean that Centurios was chosen as a kind of named commander for these sentinels of the Emperor, who would otherwise be anonymous. His coffin could have been some kind of tribute, but this idea that they are psychic extensions of the Emperor, I think I can admit that it is a more plausible theory. Music so time. Mischief. Now some of you will be thinking, oh no, he said something about time again. Well, do not worry. Today we're going to keep it simple, and also, I already mentioned some of this before, so I will only say that a theory comes from an Inquisitor of the Chronos Order, who speculated that the Legion of the Damned were actually echoes of an alternative future sent back to guide humanity's destiny. However, and this is important, they also added that they felt compelled to believe this, since the alternative was too terrible to contemplate, which is quite vague and does not seem to support your argument much. But it fits well with my position that I do not like time mixing with fiction, or more specifically, I do not like it when it is introduced badly and lazily into fiction, because once it is there, if it is not handled properly, it can quickly set fire to the narrative elements, which tend to happen in many large franchises. So to me, if you ask me, the idea of alternative timelines does not exist in 40k. It is already quite complicated, not only because I hate it, but also for the reasons I have mentioned previously in other videos. I accept that it is possible that the Psychics or the Eldar and the Emperor are able to see potential options for future paths, but the key idea is that once it has happened, it is fixed. You cannot go back and change anything. The Autochronos was created to study the anomalous passage of time during interstellar travel through the warp, because that is a big problem for the Imperium. Time already passes differently for those who travel through space. Look for it, because I'm not going to explain it here again, but for those who travel in warp ships, they can reach their destination much later than expected. Therefore, even if a planet sends a distress call and the Imperium sends reinforcements immediately, it is very common for them to arrive and find a dead world because time cannot be controlled with precision while traversing the warp. So what might seem like a month of travel in the warp could actually be years on the outside. And this happens in both directions. Some Chaos Marines have observed that, while they were in the warp, it seemed to them that centuries had passed, when in real material space barely a year had passed. In the strangest circumstances, a ship can even reach its destination before it has technically departed. These problems are common knowledge among void travelers and must be accepted as one of the risks of warp travel. You could leave your home, and the reason you would never see your loved ones again is because by the time you returned, everyone would have died. Therefore, many of those who travel beyond their own world choose to stay in a local system, as these types of problems are much less problematic. However, once you travel further between systems and sectors of the galaxy, it is really only for those who have nothing tying them to a planet or for those who transcend mortal life, such as the Mechanicus and the Adeptus. So, does it make sense that the Legion of the Damned are time warriors trying to correct what once went wrong, hoping that in each appearance this is the one that takes them home? Personally, I do not think so, and it really is a chaotic concept coming from a member of the Chronos Order. Now, another less common theory is similar to the one that postulates that the Warp Legion is an extension of the will of the Emperor, except that here the idea is that the Legion is nothing more than an extension that acts at the behest of a malevolent higher being of the Warp, possibly Chaos, of course. The question of the Centurions remains to be resolved, but leaving that aside, this concept that the Legion of the Damned are demons that come solely from the Eldar, specifically from an old Ortak, a Lunan star shaper, whom he quotes saying that his creatures are born from the warp, that even a child could guess that they are shaped like the vaunted defenders of humanity, which is a matter as immaterial as the warriors themselves, that they are demons and must be defeated just like all those of their evil species. So this theory is based on you wanting to believe the spiteful and bitter words of the Eldari, who defame one of the most revered and glorious defenders of humanity. Most revered and glorious defenders. Well, I pass on that. So, the last theory, known as the Quadrimista Perpetual Martyrdom Thesis, was originally commissioned by the High Lords of Terra. The concept is that the Legion is a lost strike force of space marines that has somehow mixed with the matter of the warp. In general, it mixes with other ideas about them, but here the idea is that they have contracted some kind of metaphysical contagion and fear that it will spread to others. So they set out to punish the enemies of humanity as best they can and for as long as possible. But here, honestly, it does not look anything like the Legion of the Damned as we know it. In this speculation, it is also considered that, like demons, the legionaries, when they die, return to the warp and can be reborn after a while, which, given what we know about the Legion, is partly true, but it does not hold up either. It is speculated that the burning fire scene over the Legion is just a later stage in the development of this warp fire contagion. It also suggests that the aforementioned concept of pterosymbiosis, Quadrimista, concluded that warp contagion grants great psychic ability to those who suffer from it, mixing their bodies and minds with the raw material of chaos. And because of this, the Legion is able to read the Emperor's tarot with a surprising degree of precision, harnessing the immense psychic presence of the Master of Humanity and using their abilities to read the future in the turbulent tides of the warp. But, honestly, that is the only aspect of that theory that seems plausible to me, while most of Quadrimista's theories can be filed away. The two observations that are considered correct are their ability to see future events with precision to arrive when they are needed, and also that, despite the fact that their minds and bodies have suffered a lot, somewhere within them, the honor of the legionaries remains intact. Their intention is noble, although I will say that, given what we know of the figure titled as Centurion, even that is ultimately called into question. Regardless of their origin, the Legion of the Damned is an inimitable force in the galaxy. They appear with such willpower and presence of purpose that, for many enemies of humanity, the mere sight of the spectral warriors burning with immaterial flames dancing on their armor, marching towards them with a fixed and silent gaze, ignoring any damage that is coming their way, and ignoring any brother who falls beside them in battle as if it did not matter at all. The Legion of the Damned seems to have, in the truest sense, no fear of death, since, despite their protests to the contrary, even heretics and demons fear death, a true death, since any of those legionaries who fall seem to disintegrate and disappear like burned ashes that are consumed to nothing, as if they had never existed. They are a terrifying force, and if their seemingly masterful and irresistible abilities in battle are enough on their own to drive the repugnant Xenos and heretics from the battlefield, then their terrifying presence and unwavering will could be enough to tip the scales wherever the legionaries appear. The tide of battle changes at a critical moment, tipping the scales of fate in favor of the Imperium and the true servants of the Emperor. They may be plagued by madness and morbidity. They may be touched by the repugnant powers of chaos. They may even be found among the ranks of the legendary undead, but they remain loyal servants of the Imperium. Enemies who normally fight to the last breath have been seen fleeing at the arrival of the Legion of the Damned, but there is something disturbing about them, even for those Xenos who normally know no fear. They have hesitated when facing the Legion of the Damned. The Drukhari, who have seen almost all the horrors that the galaxy can offer, have fallen upon themselves when encountering the legionaries. One of them even had the audacity to tear off the mask of a damned Astartes, and it is said that what he saw inside snatched his soul, since pure terror caused the death of the Drukhari. When the numerous enemies of humanity realize that they are not facing the Emperor or his studies, nor a being of the warp, but death itself, the heretics may fight for a while, but after seeing their companions fall beside them, truly dead, the Legion continues to advance without anything being able to stop it or resist its will. The inescapable reality of eternal destruction is too much for some enemies. But who would dare to face death itself? This is what the Legion of the Damned represents for the enemies of humanity. They are not an enemy to defeat, nor a company of Astartes to outwit and outnumber. They will withstand the most devastating attacks of the heretics and the Xenos, and they will stand firm as an immaterial and immovable force. When the Legion advances, the perdition of the heretics is the only constant in their reality. The Legion of the Damned is the embodiment of death, and wherever they tread, hell follows them.